Hello and welcome to the lecture What is Project Management? By the end of this lecture, you will be able to answer the question what the main task of a project manager is, to understand what the main difference between waterfall and agile projects is and then to use which approach, to grasp the difference between internal and external projects and to explain which stages belong to a consulting project and what is the major task of a project manager during every particular stage. So let's start. Managing projects is not a new invention. As long as our civilization exists, projects always have been managed in some way. So for example, pyramids, Great Wall or Hermitage, what you see on this slide, are projects which have been successfully realized even without having modern project management tools in place. Perhaps we might have had different priorities in those times where project output, say quality, was crucial and was supposed to be realized at any cost, where the time was also not really set in stone. Let's now move to the modern times and pick some examples of good and bad projects. One of the most prominent bad project examples in Germany was the construction of a new Berlin airport. Initial planning was to start in 2007 and to finish in 2011. The total initial budget was about €500 million. However, those project goals have not been realized by far. Why? Constant scope extensions like construction of additional terminals and buildings was the reason of the delay. At the end of the day, the airport was opened 9 years later than planned and costs were 15 times higher than initially planned. Let's now take another example. Tesla Gigafactory Berlin Grünheide, which is considered as the fastest large-scale construction project in Germany's history. The project was realized almost on time and within budget. The end-to-end duration from the beginning of construction to beginning of operations took slightly more than 1 year, which is a really incredible result for projects of such scale. Those examples already gives you a feeling what project management is all about. Project is always a unique task. You always have a unique scope where time and cost act as constraints. So the task of a project manager is to realize the project success, which means to deliver the work, scope required by the customer on time or even faster, and within the planned or even lower cost. Let's now briefly talk about the existing types of project management approaches and about the main differences between them. There are two ways of doing projects, waterfall and agile, and there is a bunch of different PM methodologies which can be allocated to those both approaches. First one, the waterfall, is a classical way of doing projects where you always have a clear predefined tasks which are allocated to the project stages. In this scheme, you always start with the next stage after finishing the previous one. The agile way of doing projects looks different. The philosophy of agile is we are dealing with constantly changing environment. It's not possible to exactly foresee what tasks have to be done in the project and to set a stage-wise detailed plan. Agile works based on iterations. For Scrum methodology, they are being called sprints. At the end of each iteration, you provide your intermediate result. For Scrum, it is called minimum viable product. To the client, receive his feedback and adjust the product in the new iteration. Here, the client always has an option to add new requirements, so you constantly exchange with the client until he gets satisfied. I think you can already feel the difference between two approaches. This is an ability to flexibly react to clients' wishes, requirements, which is less the case for waterfall and more the case for agile. The main criticism on the waterfall approach is the following. You take your task specification, dive into project implementation, pop up at the end and realize the client wanted something different. In practice, waterfall projects never work this way. Even for waterfall, you have constant exchange with your client, status meetings, in order to demonstrate your progress and to be able to get your project adjusted. On this slide, you can also see an allocation of common PM methodologies to both approaches. For example, Prince2, British PM standard, can be allocated to waterfall. Scrum, Kanban, Scrumban are agile methodologies. PMBOK, a US PM standard, positions itself as a toolbox which can be used for both. IPMA standard, a European PM individual competence baseline, can be also used for both approaches. So what shall I take, waterfall or agile? What is better? The answer is it depends. So it depends on your initial situation. Simply saying we take Scrum because it sounds like the most advanced PM approach is not correct. Let's now take a closer look. Then does it make sense to use waterfall approach? It's always the case for the following situation. Before you start your project, you already have a clear understanding of how your results shall look like. In addition, you also have rigid constraints regarding time and cost prior to the project start. That means before starting the project, you commit to deliver the result to certain cost in agreed time. So waterfall is mostly used for standardized projects. That means projects that you can base your planning on previous similar projects. For example, if you have a construction project, for example, for a house, you can use data. How long does it take to set a foundation, to set the walls and so on? What are the costs from previous house construction to plan the current one? And what's the case for agile? It's applied in situations with a high level of uncertainty. And here it's less possible to plan your work in detail prior to the project start. The client is not willing to set everything in stone prior to the start, but is rather willing to test different options. So with the agile approach, you will have a higher level of flexibility to react to changing clients' needs. And that's the main difference between both approaches. On the other hand, the major criticism of the agile approach is that you are not able to exactly say what your costs will be and how long the project will take. So use agile for individual projects where client is willing to pay you based on so-called time and materials principle. That means you get money for the time you have spent for your work. So now let's briefly cover the difference between internal and external projects. The core business of consulting companies are external projects, where you work for the external clients based on your contract agreement. However, it could be also a case where you also do internal projects. For example, if your company is seeking to optimize its way of doing business, organizational structure, internal processes, etc. So you do a project within your own company. And here's no contract in place where you act as a contractor. However, it could be a case when you hire other companies for your project and here you act as a client. For internal projects, you always have lower entry communication barriers. You know the people and you have an easy access to data and stakeholders within your own company. So in general, talking from my own experience, in case of internal projects, you have more comfortable atmosphere compared to the external ones, which is mostly due to the missing contract with hard deadlines and penalties for not delivering on time. This is usually not the case for an internal project. Again, the business of consulting companies are external projects, and here you do a project for a third-party company. There is a contract in place between your company and your client. It could also be a case when you hire other companies, subcontractors for your project, and here you act as a client. For external projects, you always have higher entry communication barriers. You do not know the people from the beginning, access to data is not so easy compared to internal projects. For external projects, you have, in general, harsher atmosphere since there is a contract with rigid obligation and penalties in place. And independent on project type, internal or external, project management tools apply in the same way on both external and internal projects. So now let's move to the stages of an external project, which is your core business as a consultant. What are usually the main tasks of a project manager within each particular project stage? For the first stage, tender or direct request, depending on your expertise, you are engaged as one of the decision makers for the question, do we want this project, yes or no? For the second stage, technical and commercial proposal, normally you have the responsibility to manage both, to prepare both technical and commercial proposal. In a third stage, depending on your practical experience, you are involved in the contract negotiations. And last but not least, you are managing your project in the field in the last step. This is how it should normally work. So you see, you as a project manager are being engaged from start to finish. Now let's see how it sometimes works in practice. Sometimes you face situations where you are not a part of one or any of the three first stages. For example, you come back from a vacation and find out that you are responsible for a project that will start in the coming week. However, situation like this is more an exception than a regular case. And in this case, in this situation, you should rely on your colleagues who planned all previous steps properly. Okay, before making a deeper dive into the stages, let's take a look on so-called soft factors in the project management. See you in the next lecture.